In my first life, my sister and I were invited into the Kestrel family under the guise of opportunity. A quiet narrowing of futures disguised as generosity. And when we entered their estate for the first time, walking side by side beneath ceilings designed to make people feel smaller, I already sensed that only one of us would leave that place intact. My sister Marianne mistook the stillness for reverence, the silence for respect, and she bloomed beneath it, her voice carrying too brightly through halls that absorbed sound without returning it, while I watched the men who owned those halls exchange glances that measured rather than admired, their attention lingering not on beauty but on compliance, on how easily a person filled space without asking why it had been offered. There were two sons, of course, because families like this never raise a single successor, and the contrast between them was so stark it felt intentional. Elliot Kestrel, the elder, was affable, publicly indulgent, praised for his warmth and approachability, slipping into his orbit with the confidence of someone certain she had been expected. The younger son, Rowan, remained largely unspoken, his name mentioned only when necessary, his presence registered more as an absence, seated slightly apart, listening rather than performing, his gaze unsettling not because it lingered, but because it didn't need to. Marianne leaned toward me afterward and whispered that he gave her chills, that men like that were best avoided. That quiet was always a warning sign. And she laughed as though she hadn't just revealed the shape of her own blind spots. In my previous life, I married Rowan. Not because I chose him, but because Marianne pushed me forward with a smile that felt generous until you examined the force behind it. Because Elliot had already claimed her attention and she was unwilling to risk competition where admiration mattered most. The arrangement was settled quickly, efficiently, with minimal ceremony. And while Marianne's wedding unfolded in front of cameras and curated guests, mine passed almost unnoticed, a legal formality dressed up as intimacy. Rowan did not pretend to be something he wasn't. He did not offer romance, reassurance, or validation. What he offered instead was structure, predictability, and a distance that never shifted, no matter how much pressure was applied. Marianne didn't last. The life she chose required restraint she didn't possess. What began as frustration became isolation, then fear, then a volatility that could no longer be excused as temperament. Arguments spilled into public spaces. Apologies followed. Patterns repeated. I stayed quiet. Rowan preferred it that way. Silence, I learned, was not absence in his world. It was accumulation. The night Marianne killed me, she was desperate. She asked me to meet her somewhere high, somewhere open, somewhere she believed would grant her the illusion of control. And she spoke in fragments about unfairness, about stolen futures, about how some people survive simply by being overlooked. Her hands were shaking when they touched my back, but the push itself was decisive, practiced in the mind long before the body followed through. And as I fell, the last thing I saw was not guilt in her expression but relief. When I woke again, I was seated in the Kestrel estate once more, sunlight striking the same cold surfaces, the same men arranged in the same deliberate configuration, and this time, Marianne's smile faltered when our eyes met. She remembered. I could see it in the way her breathing changed, in how quickly she moved to speak before anyone else could shape the narrative. She didn't hesitate. She never did when she thought she was winning. She took my hand, pressed it into Rowan's without asking, and announced that I was better suited to his temperament, that I was adaptable, unassuming, unlikely to challenge him, that Elliot required someone vibrant, someone visible, someone like her. I agreed immediately. Submission disarms people far more effectively than resistance, and I had already learned that Rowan did not resent being chosen by default. His grip tightened briefly around my fingers, not in warning but in acknowledgement, and I felt the quiet recalibration of intent pass between us without a word exchanged. Across the room, Elliot laughed and drew Marianne toward him, pleased, distracted, already convinced the future had bent in his favor. This time I knew better. Marriage to Rowan unfolded exactly as it had before, which was to say without illusion. But this time I understood the architecture of his restraint, the way he watched systems rather than individuals, the way he waited for imbalance before intervening. He did not ask about my past. He did not inquire about my preferences. He observed what I noticed, what I remembered, what I anticipated, and gradually, imperceptibly, his attention sharpened. Doors that had once remained closed opened slightly. Conversations paused when I entered rather than continued. Decisions shifted after I spoke, though no one acknowledged the influence directly. Marianne began to feel it before she could articulate it. She complained that Elliot was distracted, that meetings excluded her, that people no longer reacted to her presence the way they once had. She blamed exhaustion, then jealousy, then me. When she confronted me, her voice was light but her eyes frantic. She accused me of manipulating Rowan, of stealing relevance she had earned, of changing outcomes that should have been fixed. I listened. I said nothing. Silence again did its work. By the time she realized the family no longer trusted her stability, it was already documented, contextualized, and quietly acted upon. Authority shifted. Oversight increased. Elliot stopped defending her and began managing her, his affection replaced by patience that felt conditional. Marianne unraveled quickly once admiration was withdrawn, her desperation escalating into recklessness, her movements monitored long before she noticed the net closing around her. The second time she tried to push me, there were witnesses she couldn't see and safeguards she didn't understand. She never fell. What happened instead was quieter, more efficient, and far more final. And Rowan, standing beside me as the world rearranged itself, did not ask whether I regretted anything. He already knew the answer. She was present in body, but her influence had been carefully dissected and redistributed, piece by piece, until she existed only as a shadow of her former authority. People began to speak around her, not to her. Decisions that had once required her input bypassed her entirely, rooted through Rowan and me without fanfare. At first, she protested with words sharpened like knives, accusing me of interference, of betrayal, of undermining her because I had survived where she had failed. I smiled when she accused me, though my smile was slow, deliberate, and left no warmth behind. Survival, I had learned, is a lesson best taught quietly. Rowan's hands never touched mine in these moments, though I could feel his presence as if it were gravity, the way light bends towards something massive and inevitable. Marianne's anger became an obsession. Every misstep she made, every overlooked invitation, every frown that did not bow to her command, she catalogued as evidence of my cunning. She raged, whispered, and attempted to bend the course of events back in her favor, but the estate had changed. People moved differently, their loyalties recalibrated by subtle gestures, by the half-smile of approval, by the unspoken authority of Rowan's watchful eyes. In the past, I would have faltered at the sight of her rage, my hands shaking, my voice lost in the wind of her fury. This time I observed it. I noted the patterns, the cadence, the desperation in the way her sentences fractured before she realized she was already failing. By the time she recognized the consequences of her own choices, the damage had been done quietly, irreversibly. She existed now as a caution, as an example of what happens when brilliance is untempered by patience. Rowan never spoke about Marianne, yet his gaze followed her like a shadow, calculating, weighing, cataloging. There was no affection in it, no invitation to reconciliation or shared memories, only observation. He had learned in his own quiet way that power grows not in reaction, but in anticipation. And I had learned to anticipate alongside him. Together, we became a single force, silent, deliberate, unremarkable to anyone who did not know the rules of the game. Our marriage, previously a formality, now became an architecture, a structure built from patience, strategy, and restraint. Every word I spoke carried weight because I had learned to wield absence as effectively as presence. Every glance I allowed him to catch was calculated to convey observation, not emotion, and yet it was enough. Rowan responded not because he loved me, though perhaps he did in the most private way possible, but because he respected the precision of my patience. Together, we built a network of quiet authority that suffocated Marianne before she could even understand the space she once occupied. The day she finally confronted me in private, I saw it in her eyes before her words reached my ears. Panic, disbelief, and a faint, desperate hope that perhaps I had miscalculated. I listened, nodding slowly, letting her speak, letting her believe she had the upper hand because words are often more dangerous than silence, and silence is often more effective than action. Rowan waited outside the room, his presence implied rather than explicit, his power in reserve, unspoken but palpable. By the time she realized there was nothing left to manipulate, she was already trapped inside her own spiral. The consequences of her recklessness documented, reinforced, and observed from multiple angles. She could no longer move without oversight. Her influence, once wide and bright, had narrowed to nothing more than whispers, barely audible over the steady rhythm of our consolidation. I remember watching her once, weeks later, at a gathering designed for appearances rather than substance. The way she flinched when Rowan's gaze fell upon her, and I understood fully how complete her undoing had become. She moved through the room as if it were a haunted house, each step measured, hesitant, weighed against invisible barriers she could no longer see. I did not gloat. There was no satisfaction in gloating. Satisfaction had been replaced by inevitability. The calm understanding that choices, even those made in the name of family or love or ambition, carry consequences that cannot be reversed. Rowan and I existed now in a space she could not penetrate, a quiet, impenetrable architecture of intent and patience. I had survived her push, her desperation, her cunning, and in the silence that followed, I realized that true power is rarely loud. It is quiet, calculated, unforgiving. By the end, Marianne's presence was like a distant storm, felt but not seen, a warning echoing through corridors that had once bent to her will. No one asked her opinion, no one waited for her decisions, and Elliot, for all his charm, had retreated into his own carefully constructed orbit, indifferent to the collapse of a star that had once burned too brightly for its own good. Rowan and I walked through the estate like ghosts among the living, our existence unnoticed, our influence unspoken, and yet absolute. People no longer dared test boundaries. They had learned the quiet lesson. The hands that do not move still hold power, and the gaze that does not shift still sees everything. And as I stood beside Rowan, watching the world bend itself around decisions we had long anticipated, I understood fully what survival truly meant. It was not about outpacing others. It was about outlasting them, quietly, patiently, until inevitability became the only path remaining. Marianne had thought she was shaping fate, pushing forward with force and intent. But fate, it turned out, preferred the patient architect. She had tried to push me into a role I had refused, and in the end, her own ambition became the instrument of her undoing. The lesson was simple, though it had taken 2 lives to learn. The hands that push recklessly are often the first to fall, and the quiet, deliberate ones, the ones who wait, who observe, who endure, inherit the space they leave behind.